If you grew up feeling invisible, even when you were surrounded by people, this video is about you. Not ignored in an obvious way, not abandoned, but quietly overlooked. You were there. You always were. But somehow no one seemed to really notice what you felt. You learned early that your presence didn't make much difference. That rooms carried on the same whether you spoke or stayed silent. That your emotions arrived softly and left without leaving a mark. So you stopped trying to be seen. Not because you didn't want connection, but because wanting it felt pointless. You may remember moments where you waited for someone to ask how you were doing, and no one did. Where you hoped someone would notice the shift in your mood, and nothing happened. Where you sat quietly, watching others take up space effortlessly, wondering how they did it. This isn't about being shy. This isn't about introversion. This is about what happens when a child learns that visibility doesn't bring care. It just passes unnoticed. And when that lesson is learned early, it doesn't stay in childhood. It follows you, quietly, into adulthood. Feeling invisible as a child is not the same as being alone. You can be surrounded by people and still feel unseen. You can be part of a family, a classroom, a group, and still feel like you don't quite register. This experience is subtle, which is why it often goes unnamed. There may have been food on the table, conversations happening around you, life moving forward. Nothing looked obviously wrong from the outside, but inside, something important was missing. No one consistently noticed your inner world. Your thoughts were rarely asked about. Your emotions were rarely followed up on. When you spoke, the conversation moved on quickly. When you stayed quiet, no one checked in. So you learned something quietly and efficiently. Being seen wasn't something you could rely on. This isn't a personality trait. It's not sensitivity. It's not weakness. It's an adaptation. When a child learns that attention is unpredictable or unavailable, the nervous system adjusts. You stop reaching outward. You stop expecting response. You stop offering parts of yourself that no one seems to pick up. Over time, invisibility stops feeling painful. It starts feeling normal. And what becomes normal in childhood often becomes identity in adulthood. Children don't become invisible all at once. They become invisible slowly, through repetition, through moments that are small enough to be dismissed individually, but powerful enough to shape a nervous system over time. As a child, you depended on adults not just for food or shelter, but for orientation. You learned who you were by how others responded to you. When someone noticed your excitement, it grew. When someone followed your sadness, it softened. When someone stayed present with your confusion, it settled. But when those responses were inconsistent or absent, something different happened. You may have grown up in an environment where attention was limited, where caregivers were busy, emotionally unavailable, distracted, overwhelmed, or preoccupied with their own struggles. Not cruel, not intentionally neglectful, just not fully present. So your inner world learned to wait. You might remember moments when you tried to share something, a thought, a feeling, a small victory, and it landed without response. Maybe it was acknowledged briefly and then forgotten. Maybe it was brushed aside with "not now." Maybe it was met with distraction instead of curiosity. Children don't interpret this as circumstance. They interpret it as information. What I feel doesn't register here. And when this message repeats, the nervous system adapts. You stop offering what isn't received. You stop extending yourself where there is no echo. You conserve energy by pulling inward. This is where invisibility begins to organize the self. Instead of expressing freely, you begin to observe. You learn how to stay present without drawing attention. You become skilled at blending into the background, at not needing much, at not asking questions that might go unanswered. This isn't emotional numbness. It's emotional efficiency. Your system learned that being low maintenance reduced disappointment, that expecting less hurt less, that staying unnoticed felt safer than reaching out and feeling ignored. So your body adjusted its expectations. Over time, the absence of attention stopped feeling like a loss. It became the baseline. You didn't think, "I'm being overlooked." You thought, "This is just how things are." And because there was no dramatic harm to point to, no obvious crisis, no clear event that demanded intervention, this pattern went unchallenged, quietly solidified. You learned to make yourself easy to overlook, not because you lacked depth, but because no one taught your nervous system that being seen was reliable. And once the body learns that lesson, it carries it forward, even into rooms where attention is available, even into relationships where curiosity exists, even into adulthood, long after the original conditions have changed. The child who felt invisible didn't stop needing connection. They just stopped expecting it. As an adult, invisibility doesn't disappear. It just changes form. You may be competent, reliable, present. You show up. You listen. You contribute. And yet, there is often a quiet sense that you are slightly out of frame, like you're part of the scene but never quite the focus. You might notice this in conversations. You wait for someone to ask what you think. When they don't, you tell yourself it's fine. You nod, you agree, you let the discussion move on. Later, you replay what you could have said, not with anger, but with a familiar resignation. You may notice how easy it is for you to fade into the background in groups. Others speak over you without realizing it. Decisions get made without your input, not because you weren't there, but because you didn't insist on being noticed. And insisting still feels uncomfortable. You might tell yourself you don't need attention, that you're independent, that you prefer observing. But beneath that story, there is often a quieter truth. You learned early that reaching for attention rarely led anywhere, so you stopped reaching. In relationships, this pattern can feel especially painful. You may give a lot, emotional presence, understanding, patience, while receiving very little reflection in return. You become the one who remembers details, who checks in, who notices shifts in mood. And yet, when you pull back, when you go quiet, it often takes time before anyone notices. That delay reinforces the old lesson. You might struggle to express needs clearly, not because you don't have them, but because part of you assumes they won't be met. Asking feels like setting yourself up for disappointment. So you wait. You hope someone will intuit what you're feeling. And when they don't, you retreat further inward. Invisibility can also shape ambition. You may hesitate to put yourself forward. You downplay your achievements. Compliments make you uncomfortable, not because you don't want recognition, but because it feels unfamiliar and fleeting, like something that could disappear at any moment. There is often a subtle grief here, not loud, not dramatic, just a sense that parts of you never quite made it into the world, that your inner life remains richer than what others ever see. And even when people care about you, even when they value you, that old internal rule can still be running quietly in the background. don't expect to be seen. Living this way requires constant self-regulation. You monitor how much space you take up. You adjust your tone. You soften your presence. And over time, this creates an internal conflict that is easy to overlook but hard to live with. Part of you longs to be acknowledged, to be asked questions that go deeper than surface level, to feel that your inner world matters enough to be explored. Another part of you remains guarded, convinced that wanting visibility is dangerous or naive. These parts don't fight loudly. They coexist quietly, creating a low-level tension that never fully resolves. You may feel tired after social interactions without knowing why. You may experience resentment that feels misplaced because no one explicitly did anything wrong. You may feel disconnected from others while still being surrounded by them. In some cases, invisibility turns inward. You stop noticing yourself. You lose track of your own preferences. You struggle to answer simple questions like, "What do you want?" or "How do you feel?" because you learn to look outward before looking in. The body often carries this cost. Tightness in the chest, a holding in the breath, a sense of constriction when attention turns toward you. These reactions aren't random. They are reminders of a system that learned to stay small in order to avoid disappointment. And yet, invisibility doesn't eliminate desire. It just buries it. The need to be seen doesn't disappear. It waits. It surfaces in moments of loneliness, in relationships that feel one-sided, in the quiet ache of feeling replaceable even when you're needed. This is the conflict the invisible child grows into, wanting connection without trusting it, craving recognition without knowing how to receive it, being present everywhere, while feeling truly known nowhere. The instinct to disappear didn't come from nowhere. It wasn't a flaw in your personality or a failure to be confident enough. It was a response to an environment that didn't reliably reflect you back to yourself. Invisibility was never the goal. It was the byproduct of adaptation. Your system learned that staying unnoticed reduced disappointment, that not expecting attention protected you from the quiet ache of being overlooked. And so invisibility became a kind of emotional insurance, not comfortable but familiar. This doesn't mean the past needs to be rewritten. It doesn't require confronting anyone or reframing everything as trauma. What matters here is recognition, not correction. The quiet part of you that learned to fade didn't do anything wrong. It responded intelligently to the conditions it was given. And that intelligence deserves respect. You don't need to force yourself into visibility. You don't need to suddenly become expressive or assertive or emotionally exposed. That kind of pressure would only recreate the same dynamic, being pushed into something before you're ready. What begins to shift things is something much gentler. Awareness. The simple act of noticing when you make yourself smaller, when you stop yourself from speaking, when you assume your inner world won't be met, not to judge it, not to change it, just to see it clearly. Because once a pattern becomes conscious, it no longer runs the entire system on its own. Invisibility loses its grip not through effort, but through acknowledgement. You begin to recognize that the rooms you're in now are not the rooms you grew up in, that the silence you learned was situational, not essential, that being seen doesn't automatically lead to loss, even if your body still expects it to. This doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds gradually, in moments that are easy to miss. A sentence you don't swallow, a feeling you don't dismiss, A pause where you allow yourself to stay present instead of retreating inward. Nothing dramatic, nothing performative, just small permissions given slowly. You were not invisible because you lacked substance. You were invisible because no one taught your nervous system that your inner world would be met with consistency. That wasn't a reflection of your worth. It was a reflection of your environment. And the part of you that learned to disappear did so to keep you intact. You don't have to erase that part. You don't have to outgrow it. You don't have to fight it. You only need to recognize it. Because invisibility was never who you were. It was what you learned. And learning can soften. Your presence doesn't have to be loud to be real. Your voice doesn't have to compete to be valid. Your inner world doesn't need permission to exist. You are allowed to take up space quietly, gradually, in your own way. Not because you've earned it. Not because you've healed enough. But because you were never meant to disappear in the first place.